Welcome to the Fear and Greed business interview. I'm Michael Thompson. Easter is a marquee event on the retail calendar. Obviously, there's a big focus on food. You've got big family meals, you've got plenty of Easter treats, and that sees a spike in spending. But of course, the 4-day long weekend also means a perfect occasion for DIY projects and obviously for travel. So I wanted to take a quick look today at what we are actually spending money on, what it means for retailers, and then in turn, what it means for the broader economy. Fleur Brown is Chief Industry Affairs Officer at the Australian Retailers Association. Fleur, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Michael.
Just how important is the Easter long weekend? I mentioned that it is a marquee event for retail, but I suppose how does it kind of rate and compare to, say, Christmas and Boxing Day and Valentine's Day? I'm assuming Valentine's Day is kind of another big one as well, and the more recent arrival, I suppose, as well, of Black Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, they're all very important. As you say, that we call them seasonal events, I guess, in retail. And all of the ones you mentioned are important for retailers to plan for, and definitely they see an absolute spike in business at that time. The really big one is Christmas and that holiday spending season. Everything pales to insignificance beside that, but Easter's definitely well up there. We're looking at spending about 18 billion across the country for Easter. It's significant not only because of the celebrations attached to it, but also it's the last holiday before our winter. So a lot of people are trying to sneak in a trip, some DIY, as you mentioned, and you sort of look at it as quite a focused period of holiday making for that reason.
Fleur, I mentioned those three categories in the intro. There was the DIY projects that you just mentioned, the holiday travel and Easter food and chocolate. Now, research that you have put out from the Australian Retailers Association and from Roy Morgan suggests that we are going to spend that's a huge figure, $18 billion across those kind of categories. How does it compare broadly to previous years?
Look, it's fairly similar to last year, but with some little sort of peaks and troughs within the different categories of spending. So in saying that it's fairly similar to last year, of course, you've got to factor in price inflation into that. So when it comes to what retailers are actually making in a profitable sense, you know, they're having to deal with a whole lot of increased costs of doing business within that. So look, overall, it's not a bad result at all, considering the kind of economic situation that we're in Australia. Lots of belt tightening. There's a sort of a 6-month lag effect with interest rate pressures that we're still feeling when it comes to consumer spending. So a pretty good result.
That is actually really quite good when you consider that there was research out this week, the ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Survey, and it shows that confidence is up slightly, but I think it was 21% of Australians say that their families are better off financially than this time last year, compared to I think 52% or thereabouts that say their families are now worse off. So that does actually seem quite good then, if we are still spending roughly the same amount as we were then last year. Does these concerns over the cost of living crisis kind of push spending down typically heading into a period like Easter, or is it the fact that Easter kind of comes around once a year? It is a one-off. People are still going to be getting together with their families. They're still going to be kind of giving those gifts and things at Easter. Is there an element of, you know what, it's a one-off, we will keep spending?
We've definitely seen a trend towards experiences and Australians wanting to spoil themselves and others because they've earned it with all the pain and suffering that everyone's been through over the last few years. So that sort of sentiment continues, but within a reality check of, you know, the absolutely budget conscious focus that we have. Of course, not everyone's dealing with the interest rate rises when it comes to a mortgage. Some people have paid off their mortgages, a fairly healthy percentage of the population. But then there's that segment that are dealing with increased rental or mortgage interest rate, creep. And that's definitely affecting spending. But it is counterbalanced by the fact that people want to, yes, continue to spoil themselves and others. We definitely see that come into play during events, family events in particular, like the Easter holiday period.
Stay with me, Fleur. We'll be back in a moment. I'm speaking to Fleur Brown, Chief Industry Affairs Officer at the Australian Retailers Association. Now, food is obviously a big one, particularly at this time of year. And anecdotally, kind of when I was young, when I was working in a supermarket, it was always the case that the biggest day of the year, the busiest day of the year, when kind of the shopping trolleys would be lined up the aisles, it wasn't kind of Christmas Eve, it wasn't leading into New Year's or anything like that. It was the Thursday before Good Friday. It was always massive, and then Good Friday is kind of synonymous with lines out the door of kind of fish and chip shops and traffic jams around fish markets. So clearly the demand is really quite heavily concentrated.
Well, it's kind of embarrassing to turn up for an Easter feast without hot cross buns or the required amount of chocolate and Easter eggs. And of course, this panic that sets in because sometimes they literally do sell out. So yeah, it's a bit different to Christmas in that sense, where you've got a little bit more scope to choose what you're going to turn up with.
And then the seafood demand as well. And we're spending more this year on chocolate. That spend is up quite significantly based on the figures. Why is this?
There's probably a lot that goes into that. Prices have increased in certain areas, particularly if you're looking at imported chocolate, for example. So, that can come into play. There was someone who did a whole analysis piece on all of the different factors that go into chocolate pricing, and it certainly has been a challenging period for chocolates. That's coming into play there. Look, I would also hazard a guess, I'm no psychologist, but, chocolates are great.
It's a comfort food.
Comfort food, mood enhancer, stress factor, that's definitely part of it. I think we saw the same trend through the pandemic too.
So it's the combination then of the comfort food. Everyone's kind of going for the chocolate, but also we're seeing these pressures, the price pressures on chocolate and the ingredients that go into it coming from overseas as well. So it's combining. We still need it, and we're willing to pay more for it.
And we will have our chocolate. Yeah, Australians are amongst the top chocolate consumers in the world. Actually, I don't have that data point in front of me, but I've definitely seen the studies.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone's going to question you on that one. I think that's almost guaranteed. The other interesting point I saw from the research was that a third of Australians are going to use the long weekend for DIY. I'm assuming this is what happens every year. Is it? How much are we spending?
Yeah, look, we've definitely seen a DIY trend through the pandemic, and it's nice to see that that's sort of continuing that kind of nesting aspect. Certainly the Easter weekend is a trigger because it's that last holiday period before winter really sets in. So if you're getting outdoors, getting into the garden, that sort of thing, it's a good time to do it. We're looking at about 7.8 million Australians projected to take on do-it-yourself projects this Easter. So to give you some dimension to that, about 10% of those are spending above $2,000. So that would be the really more significant project category. Everyone else is sort of looking at sort of an average spend of about $852 per individual. That's just down a touch from last year. So we're probably talking about a nice coat of paint, some gardening, a bit of fencing, for that kind of spend.
I just love there's probably other stories behind these statistics as well, that all of a sudden, if you've got kind of 7.8 million people saying that they're going to be doing DIY over the 4 days of the long weekend, I would love to see the corresponding increase in ambulance call-outs and hospital visits across this period as well, because it would have to be there, right?
Like the Christmas tree hazards, when you're putting up the lights.
Yeah. Now, travel is the other big one, and we have mentioned this. There's a big jump in spending on overseas travel. It seems suggesting that there is that certain kind of portion of the population that is kind of somewhat immune to these cost of living pressures.
Yes, it's combined with this sort of built-up pressure to travel overseas, with a lot of people putting off those trips in recent years. Due to COVID, just due to being more conservative about travel generally. And so what we're seeing is the return of some of that desire for international travel. So about $9.6 billion being spent on Easter travel, and that's up about $500 million on 2023, or about 5%. A lot of that is being spent on overseas trips at the expense of domestic spending, and overseas trips naturally are more expensive. So that sort of explains some of those numbers. So around 4.4 million Australians, or 20% of the population aged over 18, plan to take a holiday over the Easter period. And, that's sort of divided between their own state, interstate, and overseas.
Yeah, and as you say, that is at the expense of the domestic travel, which isn't great news, I then imagine, for local tourism operators and local retailers that kind of rely on that school holiday and public holiday boom.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's understandable that we're seeing that shift for the reasons we've just mentioned, but it is not to be underestimated, that will create an impact in Australia, because through that pandemic period, that was really part of the thing that saved many retailers and hospitality operators, was the fact that people weren't spending on international travel. So that does have to be considered. But at the same time, we've also got, more than 1 million people in the country now than we had a year ago, so that they are also bolstering our spend.
One last question about travel. School holidays. What does that do to spending? Because about half the country has school holidays aligning with Easter and the Easter long weekend. The other half is delayed for a week or two. Does that then mean that you see kind of this travel spend spread out more, and it essentially becomes almost a month of boom time?
Absolutely, you would see that. But then there's quite a lot of evidence that people are also looking to travel within their own state if they are travelling domestically. And that may just be because it's not a super long break. Not everyone's going to take the school holiday period. They might just sort of look at the Easter break itself. So, yeah, it does create a staggered effect. As annoying as those different dates are, it definitely helps spread the money.
It does make it very, very complicated, particularly if you're trying to plan things and trying to coordinate across state lines. It does get a little bit tricky. Fleur, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks so much, Michael.
That was Fleur Brown, Chief Industry Affairs Officer at the Australian Retailers Association. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Michael Thompson. Have a great day.